Local storyteller Steve Andrasko, right here, is well known for presenting spooky stories to audiences throughout South Texas. He has also spoken at many UFO festivals, including the Edinburgh UFO Festival several times. In fact, Steve, I don't know if you remember, but you were in the original Edinburgh UFO Festival with Stanton Friedman, the late great Travis Walton. We had some really good speakers that first year to kick off the very first Edinburgh UFO conference in 2012, believe it or not. So Steve was one of the speakers, and I found a picture the other day of all of us with Travis, with Stanton, standing as speakers for that first conference. Steve has also spoken at the Del Rio UFO conference, which Daniel mentioned, and you remember seeing Steve there. I don't know if you remember that they took us around town in some kind of weird UFO parade. We were on the back of tractors, and a flatbed attached to a tractor with lights and little alien figures. That was quite a blast. That was around 2012, 2011. So anyway, please welcome Mr. Steve Andrasko.
Okay, well, I'm used to telling stories to little kids mostly nowadays. I've been doing a lot of substitute teaching for special ed kids is what I do. I needed some money to go on my vacation that I just got back from. I went over to England, and my son was graduating from Cambridge, so I needed some spending money to get over there and back. And so I thought I'd start out with a story. When I talk to kids, as a librarian, we'd have to talk about what's fiction and what's nonfiction. So I tell them a story that happened to me, and I tell them, do you think this is fiction or is it real? So I have a place up in Oklahoma that was my grandfather's place, and it's kind of out in the woods. It's a little spooky if you go there at night because there's no street lights or anything. And so I go up there to work on it. The place is kind of falling apart, but so one day I was up there, and it was just me. My wife didn't go. In fact, even though she's from there, she doesn't like going back up there. But I was sitting there, and I was reading one of my favorite stories, and it had gotten dark, and I was sitting there reading, and then all of a sudden, there was a knock on the door. I said, who comes down here at night? Nobody ever comes to visit me. So I got up, and I opened the door, and there was nobody there. So I looked over here and looked over there, and then, that's odd. So I was about to shut the door. Oh my gosh, there she was. And she had this long, stringy hair, this long, pointy nose. And she looked at me, and I said, what do you want? And she said, would you like to know what I can do with my long red fingernails and my ruby red lips? Her breath was like nacho cheese Doritos and Mountain Dew. I said, no, I don't, and I shut the door. My heart was beating. I thought, I can't read, I'm going to turn on the TV and watch something. So I went over and I turned on the TV, and I just started watching something when there it was again, somebody knocking at the door. So I got up and I opened the door and looked out. Nobody there. I looked over here, I looked up, down. So I was about to shut the door. Oh, there she was again. She had the hair, she had the nose, and there was like a wart on the end of her nose with a couple little hairs growing out. And I go, ew, what do you want? She said, would you like to know what I can do with my long red fingernails and my ruby red lips? Her breath was like pepperoni pizza and Mountain Dew or Dr. Pepper or something. And I said, no, I do not. And I shut the door. Man, was she ugly? Did you see her? I said, well, I don't know. I need to relax. So I went over and got a record. Of course, most kids don't know what records are. And I took it and put it on my record player and started listening. And there it was for the third time. So I got up and I opened the door, looked all around. I started to close the door and I opened it again. Nobody there. So I was about to shut the door. Oh my gosh, there she was again. She had the hair, she had the nose, and I think there was something green hanging from her nose. And I said, what do you want? And she went, would you like to know what I can do with my long red fingernails and my ruby red lips? And I said, no, I don't. But if you tell me where you go away and leave me alone. She said, okay. And I said, then what is it that you can do? And she took her long red fingernails and she went like this. And that's what she could do with her long red fingernails and her ruby red lips. I wasn't sure adults would like that story. But when I first came here, I lived out in Rio Grande City and I got a job working at Roque Guerra Elementary School. And I taught third grade, and I had a couple of joker third graders that, they were always playing tricks on me. And I remember one of them's name was Javier, but I don't remember the other two's names, but they were always playing some kind of practical joke on me, and so I heard this story from them. Now, I haven't been out to Rio Grande City in a while, but when I was there 40 years ago, it was pretty small, and right almost across the street from the school, there's a cemetery. It's the Rio Grande City Historical Cemetery. And these kids had to walk across the cemetery to get to school and back. And so as they walked across the cemetery, they would show me stuff that they picked up in the cemetery. And they told me this story, and the one said that he was walking through the cemetery, and he kept finding all these cool things, like maybe coins or buttons or hair ribbons or combs, things like that. And one day, one of his parents' friends had died, and they were going to have his funeral. And so the boy asked his mother and dad if he could go to the funeral too, because he had never seen a dead person before, and so he was kind of curious. And they said, well, okay, you can go. And so he went to the funeral. They had the funeral, and they had the casket open, and he went in. He looked at the dead body, and then they closed it up, took him out to the cemetery. So they followed along, and they had a ceremony there, and then they lowered the coffin down in the grave. And he noticed, his parents were wiping their tears, and the people were wiping their tears. And he noticed when the ladies would reach into their purse and with their hanky, and as they dried their eyes, things would fall out, maybe a coin or something out on the ground. And the men too, they would grab their handkerchief and wipe their eyes, and he said, he noticed, maybe that's why I find these things. And so they went home, and he the next day was Sunday, I think, and he said, hey, Mom, Dad, can I go back to the cemetery tomorrow? She said, well, if you do your chores and everything, you can go back. And so he got up real early, did his chores, went to church and that, and then went out to the cemetery. And when he got there, he noticed that they'd filled in the grave of the guy that had died. And so he was going around, looking around, and he picked up, a silver dollar. He put it in his pocket, and he went, oh, there's another hair ribbon. And he picked it up, and then he was walking along, and he saw something shiny down in the grass. So he went over, and he looked down, and it looked like something made of gold. And he pushed the grass part, and there was a little gold chain on the ground. He said, oh, wow. So he reached down, and he picked up that chain. Oh, my gosh, he pulled him back down to the ground. He said, but I don't want to have that chain. So he reached down again, and he pulled real hard. Boom! And pushed it back down to the ground again. So this time, he put both feet down, grabbed with both hands, and pulled up out of the ground a long gold chain with a pocket watch on the end of it. He said, oh, wow. And he took that watch, shined it up on his shirt, and he opened it up, and it was ticking. And he said, oh, wow, I'm going to run home with this. And as he was walking, he saw a guy there, standing there. He was in a suit, tie. It looked like one of the guys that had been at the funeral, one of his dad's friends. And as he walked by, the guy said, can you tell me what time it is? And the boy said, oh, sure. And he opened up the watch, and then when he looked at the guy, oh, my gosh. His face was melting off. His nose fell off. He had this old skeleton face. And he said, what time is it? What time is it? The boy was so scared, he put the watch in his pocket and he ran home. But when he got home, nobody was there. And then he remembered his dad and mom were going to be out on the ranch fixing the barbed wire fence where some of the livestock was getting out. He says, oh gosh, I'm going to have to wait here by myself until they get home. So he was sitting there, and he heard a knock on the door. So he got up and he opened the door, and there was an old lady standing there. And she said, excuse me, could you tell me what time it is? And he said, oh yeah. And he picked up his pocket watch. And then when he looked up at the lady, he was an old skeleton walking like that. He slammed the door, but as he slammed the door, it caught on her hand, and her hand fell down and was running around on the floor. And he opened the door, kicked the hand out, and he was so scared. And he said, maybe I could get out the back door. And he went to look out the window, but there were all these skeletons there. And they were all going, what time is it? What time is it? And he was so afraid. He locked all the doors and he sat there until there was no more noise. And he said, oh, it's getting kind of late. Maybe my family will be back soon. So he peeked out the window. There was no one there. And he opened up the door and went out and he was looking down the road, and he saw people getting closer. And closer and closer. It was his mom and dad. Oh, man. And so they came home, and he thought, maybe I should tell my mom and dad about what happened. But he thought, I better not. I better not tell them. And so he didn't. And his mom cooked up the dinner and everything, and then he looked at it, and his mom says, aren't you going to eat? He says, no. I'm not hungry. So he went up to bed, all without supper. But that night, he kept hearing noises, and he looked around, and he saw again out the window, people were saying, what time is it? What time is it? And he got so scared, but he wanted to wake up his mom and dad, but he was too scared. And he thought, what am I going to do? He said, I bet those are the people from the cemetery, and they want their watch back. So he thought, maybe I'll just open up a window and throw it out. But he went to the window. There they were, staring in the window at him. What time is it? What time is it? He said, I don't know what to do. And he kept hearing it tick-tock, tick-tock. He said, I don't know. He opened up his closet, threw it in there under his dirty socks and underwear, and shut the door, but it kept ticking louder. He took it, he said, oh my gosh. He put it under his pillow on his bed, but it kept ticking louder. Tick-tock, tick-tock. And he kept hearing the people knocking on the windows. What time is it? What time is it? And he thought, I know. And he grabbed the watch and the chain, and he opened up his mouth, and he swallowed the watch and the chain. And everything was quiet. No ticking. Looked out the windows. No one was there. Thank goodness. But he went to bed that night, And even though it was the middle of summer, he got real cold. He woke up, he says, I need a blanket. But when he looked up, there was a man staring down at him. He had long white hair and a long beard. And he said, who are you? And the man said, I'm Father Time, and I'm afraid your time has run out. Well, the next day the boy didn't come down for breakfast, so the mom sent the brother up to get him. And when he went up to see him, he was in bed like this. And he ran downstairs, Mom, Dad, I can't wake him up, there's something wrong with him. So the mother ran upstairs, she grabbed him, he's like this. She said, quick, run into town and get the doctor. So the boy ran into town, brought the doctor back. The doctor came in, looked at the boy, and he was like, He said, there's nothing I can do. He says, go get the undertaker and bring him here. So the undertaker came, and they decided, well, he's dead. So they started carrying him down the stairs, the doctor and the undertaker. And as they were going down the stairs, the undertaker heard something. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. He says, hey, I hear something. He put his ear down by the boy. And the boy's like this. Ah! And he put his ear down by the boy's mouth and heard tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. The undertaker, he said to the doctor, hey, I hear something. Why don't you stick your hand down in there and see what it is? And the doctor said, I'm not doing that. You're the undertaker. Why don't you? He says, I'm not sticking my hand down in there. So they carried him down and they took him to the funeral parlor. And they got the boy all fixed up for the funeral. And so the boy, he was taken out to that cemetery in Rio Grande City, and he was buried with the watch still inside. Now, if you ever have to go to a funeral and you see some of your parents standing around wiping their eyes because somebody they loved passed away, and you look down on the ground and you see something shiny, looks like gold. Ooh. And you want to pick it up. Well, don't do it. Don't do it. Because you never know when your time will run out. And that's a story that my third graders told me, but I don't think it's really a true story. So, now, what I'm supposed to talk about, and I'm going to take a look, is Noe has a couple of new books, and this one's called Terror on the Train, and it has a lot of ghost stories or scary stories about what happened on some trains. Now, a long time ago, if you wanted to go long distances, you took the train, because very few people had any kind of automobiles, and everything ran on steam. And so, to get around, you traveled on these big steam trains. Well, those steam trains were kind of dangerous because the engines were very heavy and they ran on big steam. The locomotives, they ran on big steam engines. Now, they had firemen and different people that shoveled the coal in and kept the boiler burning to a certain temperature. And if the boiler ran dry, okay, or too hot, those things could explode and were very dangerous. Steam is very powerful, and that's why they used it to drive those big, heavy engines. And they pulled a lot of cars, so they're very hard to stop. So a lot of times when they had to stop, it took a long time to do it. And so sometimes they had a lot of accidents. And so this talks about some of those train wrecks and some of the things that happened after that. Now, the first story is about President Lincoln. It's called the Ghost Train of Lincoln. Now, I'm just going to try to tell this rather than to read from it, but President Lincoln was a very interesting character. Now, he talked about President Kennedy and some of the conspiracy things that happened when President Kennedy was assassinated. But President Lincoln's story is even more interesting and has lots of conspiracy things going on there. But when President Lincoln died, when he was shot by John Wilkes Booth, he was, of course, in the theater, he was shot in the head, and he lived for a while. The doctors were kind of in there digging around for the bullet and stuff, and it wasn't, they didn't have great medicine or anything in those days, so he didn't survive. And so after he had died, there was a guy they had decided that they were going to have a big funeral. They had one in Washington, D.C., and they decided to put him on a train and take him all the way back to Springfield, Missouri, where he was from. So the funeral guy, he decided that he would embalm him, and they had to put lots of makeup and stuff on him. When they had the huge funeral in Washington, D.C., where thousands of people came by to pay their respects to President Lincoln. Then they put him on a train, and they took him up to New York, and then they went through, I think, something like 180 cities, and they made lots of stops, and the train was all decorated in black. He has this special car on the train, which was kind of like Air Force One today, but Lincoln didn't like that. He didn't think he should be spending taxpayer money on something like that, but they still had the car, so they decided to decorate that all in black and with drapes, and that's where they put his casket. And so then as they went to these different cities, they would stop and have like a funeral service where thousands of people would come by and pay their respects to him. And of course, they didn't have refrigerator cars in those days, so you can imagine after 18 days on the road what his body might look like. So he had a special mortician there that would decorate him up and keep him as fresh as could be, and also hide the wound on his head. And so they went to all these different cities, and they finally got to Springfield, where he was buried. Now, President Lincoln, after he was buried, they moved his grave from place to place because there were some guys that wanted to dig up his body and hold it for ransom. They found several conspiracies where guys wanted to do this. So his body was dug up and reburied. Finally, it was buried under like a ton of concrete, so it could never be dug up again. But the part about the ghost is very interesting, because a year later, there were some workers in New York City, and they were working at night, and all of a sudden, at the nighttime, it was exactly a year from when President Lincoln's train went through New York. They were out working, and all of a sudden got very cold and very misty, and they could hear the sound of the wheels on the rails, and they heard a long, mournful train whistle. And as they looked up, they saw a train coming through. And it was all draped in black, and inside they could see the soldiers inside, and they even heard music being played, the same music that was played the year before when they had his funeral. And so the men, as you can imagine, freaked out with this train. And the train went by, and so the men were very frightened, and they quit working. Their clocks, their watches and their clocks stopped working, and time stood still. And all along the route that the Lincoln train took, the funeral train, the same day, the same time that it passed the year before, people all along that route witnessed the same kind of thing happening. So people were very frightened. of what it was. But they knew, because many of them had been there the year before, that it was his train. And it happened all the way from Washington, D.C., all the way back to Springfield, Missouri. And for years and years, on the exact same date, the exact same time as the original funeral train went, this occurrence would happen. And they'd see the train go by, and then it would disappear. And they would swear that it was real, but yet it didn't touch the tracks as it went by. It was like it floated over the tracks. And so people say even today, even though some of these tracks haven't been used in 100 years by any kind of passenger train, that you can still hear and see the train go by if you happen to be there in April, around the 15th of April, when this happened. Now, the other interesting thing about President Lincoln, as in the White House, many presidents, first ladies, staff members, and others that work there have witnessed and seen the ghost of President Lincoln. And one of the stories that's very funny, I think, is they had different, even some queens and kings from Europe came to visit presidents here. And they would see or hear, because a lot of times they put them in the Lincoln bedroom, and they would see and hear Lincoln at night. And one of the funny stories is Winston Churchill came and he stayed there. And if you know anything about Winston Churchill, he was kind of an amusing guy, even though he was a very important person. Well, he went in and took a bath, and then he came out, stark naked, lit up a cigar, and was walking back into the Lincoln bedroom. And there he saw President Lincoln standing by the fireplace. And Winston Churchill took out his cigar and he said, "Good evening, President. I think you have me at a disadvantage." And then President Lincoln disappeared. But Ronald Reagan and his wife used to say, they always heard him, and he had a dog named Rex that would not go into the Lincoln bedroom. He was afraid to go in. And there are many other presidents, first ladies, and also staff members that worked there, and visitors that came to visit, that would swear they would hear footsteps or even see the likeness of President Lincoln in the house. And I thought, well, maybe that's why our current president is tearing up the White House. Maybe he's trying to get rid of the ghost of Lincoln. And so at night, people say, why do they see that? And I said, maybe it was the president, Lincoln, that he didn't get to finish, what he started. It was only a few days after they had signed the declaration, or the proclamation that ended the Civil War, that he was assassinated. And so he wanted to bring the South and the North back to where they were peaceful, coexist, and bring the nation back together. Now, the other story in this book is not about Lincoln, but it's about John Wilkes Booth, the man who assassinated President Lincoln. And what happened, of course, after the assassination, he escaped. It was 12 to 18 days later when he was finally found in a barn, and supposedly he was shot and killed by some soldiers. He was shot in the neck, and that they took him out and they buried him. But the story is, or many conspiracy things is, the guy they shot was not John Wilkes Booth. It was just some vagabond that was staying in this barn, and that they shot him and buried him, and said that they had captured the assassin and buried him. Now, why that conspiracy exists is because there was a man who lived, of course, he talked about Granville, Texas, that moved to Granville, Texas, and he changed his name fact, he changed his name 2 to 3 different times as he tried to hide himself from being captured. Now, Granville's a place where a lot of guys went to hide out. Billy the Kid, Jesse James, a lot of these people went to Granville and changed their names and disguised themselves so they could live out their old age without being captured and put in jail. Well, he lived there for a while, and he got sick, and he worked as a bartender of all things, and he got sick, and he decided to confess to his crime. And so the doctor came, because he was very sick, and confessed that he was the one, that he was actually John Wilkes Booth who had killed the president. Well, guess what? The doctor got him all doctored up, and he didn't die. So what did he do? He ran away to Oklahoma and changed his name again. And this time he had gotten married, and he was living out a life. He was working in a furniture store / funeral parlor. He was working there. And again, he thought he was going to die. And so he called his wife and the preacher in, and he told him that he was really John Wilkes Booth. This is the second time he confessed. And guess what? Again, he didn't die. So he ran off to Enid, Oklahoma, and there the funeral parlor guy he worked for said, "I know this guy. I've got to capture him." So when he got up there, he decided to commit suicide. So he took some arsenic or strychnine, and this time he did die. Well, the funeral parlor guy knew who he was, or thought he knew who he was. So he argued with the wife if he could have the body. And so finally he obtained the body of John Wilkes Booth. He said, "I can make some money off of this." And so since he ran the funeral parlor, he had him embalmed, and then he would charge admission for people to come and see the body of John Wilkes Booth. So he was making a lot of money, but then he passed away. Well, another guy who had been the lawyer that had been a friend of the funeral parlor guy, he says, "I can make some money off of this too." So the embalmer guy had embalmed him, and he basically had been mummified. And this was about the time of King Tut's discovery. So everybody in America was all excited about mummies. Well, this guy took the body of John Wilkes Booth, and he took him around the country on a circus train, and they charged admission to come and see his body. And then he also even wrote a book that he sold 75,000 copies of, telling about this person, John Wilkes Booth, who had changed his name, who was really the assassin of President Lincoln. Well, he traveled around, and it turns out, like King Tut, this guy had a curse. So everybody that started doing business with him, this guy was shot in the back and killed in Chicago. The guy had owned him. So another guy who ran the circus, he was a tattooed guy, obtained the body and took him around. Well, they were riding on the circus train to San Diego, and the train wrecked, and there was about 20 or 30 people who died, but the body was unscathed. So again, the body ended up with another collector, and they occasionally would show the body, and then it was finally bought by someone, and the body has disappeared. Well, the odd things were, talking about conspiracies, this guy who confessed, he said that he was under orders by the vice president of Lincoln to shoot Lincoln. He was even given passwords so he could escape from the army. Gave up passwords, and they would let him go. And so he claimed it was a conspiracy, that he killed him and that it wasn't his idea. And so now his body is somewhere, they believe in Ohio. There's a guy that collects weird stuff, mummies and things like that, and that his body is somewhere in a basement in Ohio somewhere. but we don't know. And so a lot of these paranormal guys, they said, hey, we need to dig up that body that they said was his and have some DNA tests done and see if it matches some of the relatives of his. And the cemetery owners said they won't give permission to have the body dug up. So today we still don't know if that's the real body of John Wilkes Booth, and the other body of this guy, we don't know where it's at, the mummified body. So it's kind of a weird story that goes with President Lincoln's assassination. Now another kind of odd story that goes along with that was about a year or so before President Lincoln was assassinated, John Wilkes' brother, who was also an actor, a Shakespearean actor, his name was Edward, he was at a train station in New York when President Lincoln's son, Robert, he fell off the train platform in between the train and a moving train and the platform. And John Wilkes' brother had grabbed him and pulled him up. So his brother saved President Lincoln's son from death, while the other brother killed President Lincoln. It was a good thing because President Lincoln had 4 children, and the one he saved was the only son that lived into adulthood. All of President Lincoln's other 3 boys all died young. And so that was kind of a weird, kind of a ghost story. That's in Noe's book, Terror on the Train. All right. Now, I guess I probably have time for one more story. But there's a lot of good stories in there. There's one, The Groom of La Llorona, which is a story, everybody knows La Llorona, but this is a story that takes place right in San Benito. And talks about, it's kind of the same story, but it also talks about the husband and what happened to him after his wife drowned her children and drowned herself in the Resaca in San Benito. What happened to her husband? And it's an interesting story that's in Noe's book. The last story I thought I would tell is a story I first heard in Branson, Missouri. I went to a storytelling festival to hear guys tell stories. And they told a story about a guy named John. Now, I've heard this story several times in different storytelling and library events I've gone to. And so there's a little bit different versions to this story. Now, a long time ago, there was this guy named John, and he wasn't a very nice person, but he was a blacksmith. And in those days, blacksmiths were very important because farmers, if they wanted tools, plows, and things like that, he would make them, or if they broke, he would fix them. People wanted iron skillets and things. Ladies, they would go to him, he'd make them a skillet, or maybe he'd fix one of their skillets for them. And then, of course, people with horses would like horseshoes for their horses, and so he would make shoes and also shoe the horses. And so he was a very important person, but this guy was not very nice. His name was John, but they called him Wicked John because he wasn't very nice. Now, he had this shop where he worked, his blacksmith shop, and outside his shop, he had these beautiful roses that grew there. And he really liked those roses. But these church ladies would come by, especially on Sunday, and they would pick the roses to take them to church and put them on display. And he'd get really mad. And he'd yell at those ladies, "Stop picking my roses." But they'd just laugh at him and run off. In fact, sometimes they would come, and one lady would poke a hole in one of her pots and say, "Can you fix this?" And while he was fixing it, they'd steal flowers off his rose bush. Now, the other thing he really liked, of course, was his hammer. That's how he did his work. He had several hammers, and he had one 10-pound hammer. And sometimes the school kids would come by, and while he wasn't looking, they would steal his hammer, and they'd go out and pound rocks with it. They played a game, throw the hammer, who could see who could throw the hammer the farthest. And when John would look around to get his hammer, he'd find it way out, some boys playing with it. He'd run out there and he'd say, give me back my hammer. You're the worst kids I ever seen. And they'd laugh, and they'd drop the hammer, and they would run, and he'd have to go get his hammer. And the other thing in his shop he really liked, he had a rocking chair. It had been his mother's rocking chair. And after he was done working a hard day's work, he'd like to sit in that rocking chair and rock. And he didn't want anybody sitting in it. But sometimes people would come to have work done, and they'd sit in his chair, and he'd yell at them, "Get out of my rocking chair. I don't want anybody sitting in there," because that was his mother's chair. Well, the years went by, and he didn't get any nicer. He just got kind of meaner. But one night, it was pouring rain, lightning, wind, and there was a knock on his door. And he opened up the door, and there was this old man sitting there, and he was all wet and freezing. And John said, "Come on in and sit down by the fire. I was just about to have dinner." He said, "Would you like something to eat?" So he took the food over to this old man, and the old man, he took a bite, and the old man got a little taller and stronger, and he took another bite, and the man started to glow a little bit, and he took another bite, and he was very tall, he was very bright and very white, long white hair and beard, and he said, "Who are you?" And he said, "Well, if you ever went to church, you'd know who I am, John." And he said, "Who?" He says, "I'm St. Peter." He said, "St. Peter?" He said, "Yeah, and I go around the earth once a year looking for people doing good deeds. And you did a very good deed, feeding me and taking me in." He said, "Well, then get out of here." And he said, "Well, when somebody does a good deed, I give them 3 wishes." He said, "I don't want any of your wishes." And he said, "But you have to take them. I'm not leaving until you take them." He said, "Okay, what are they?" He said, "Well, you decide." So John looked around and he said, "You see that rose bush out there?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "People are always taking my flowers." He says, "I want, if somebody takes those flowers, the bush grabs them and pulls them in and sticks them with those thorns until I say, 'Let go.'" St. Peter said, "Man, that's weird." He said, "What is your other wish you want?" And he said, "Let me think. Oh, you see my hammer? Kids are always coming and grabbing my hammer. And I want, if anybody grabs that hammer, that it'll grab a hold of them and it'll pound and pound and pound until I say, 'Let go.'" St. Peter said, "Oh, okay, that's almost weirder than the other one." He said, "What's your last wish?" And John looked around and he said, "See my rocking chair? If anybody sits in my chair, that chair will grab a hold of them and rock them and rock them and rock them until I say, 'Stop, let go.'" So St. Peter said, "Okay, that's your wish." So off he left. Well, time passed, and John just got meaner and meaner and meaner. And the devil, he was taking notice of how mean this guy was. He says, "This guy's getting pretty old. I think it's time for him to come down here." And so the devil looked around and he saw one of his young sons, and he said, "Hey, go up there. I want you to bring that John down to me." So the young devil went up, and he knocked on the door, and John looked at him. "What do you want?" He says, "My dad says, I'm going to get you, and you got to come with me." He said, "I ain't going anywhere." He said, "Yeah, you're coming with me." He said, all right, I'll come with you." And he said, but first, I got to finish shoeing this horse." He says, "You're just going to have to wait." He said, "All right." And so John said, "Why don't you just sit in that chair?" So the little devil went in there and he sat in the chair, and the chair grabbed a hold of him, started rocking him back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and the young little devil said, "I want to get out of here, let go." And he tried to get up, the chair stuck to him, he couldn't get loose, and John just laughed and laughed and just kept rocking and rocking. The old little devil was getting so dizzy and a headache. He said, "Well, tell it to stop." He said, "Not unless you promise to go away and leave me alone." He says, "I promise." So John said, "Let him go." And the poor little devil got up and walked all the way back down to hell. And when he got there, the devil said, "Where's John?" He says, I got stuck in his chair and I couldn't get away." And he said, I couldn't bring him back. So Satan said, "That guy pretty is tricky." He said, he said, he had another son who was a little bit bigger. He said, you, go get John. I want to see him. It's time for him. He's like 95 years old. He needs to be down here. So that son went up. Same thing. He came in. John said, what do you want? He says, my dad sent me up here. He says, you're coming with me. And John said, well, I've got to finish working on this plow this farmer has. Why don't you help me? He says, I ain't helping you. He says, well, I'm getting pretty old. It takes me a long time to do this work. And he says, all right, what do you want? He says, why don't you bring me my hammer so I can finish making this plow? So the devil went over and grabbed the hammer, and the hammer grabbed him and started pounding. And he got his arm got real tired. He thought he was going to fall off. He said, make it stop, John. He couldn't let go of the hammer. And of course, John just laughed and said, well, I ain't making it go. And he kept going and going. And he said, please, make it stop. He said, only if you leave me alone and don't come back. And he says, I promise. So he said, let go. And the hammer dropped. And the poor guy, his arm was hanging down here. He stuck it in his pocket and he went back down to hell. And the devil said, what happened to you? He said, look at my arm. He made me hold on to that hammer. And that's what happened. So the devil was really mad. He said, all right. And he got his oldest son. He said, go up there and get him and bring him back. And don't sit in his chair and don't pick up his hammer. He said, all right. So there was a big puff of smoke right in the middle of his shop. There appeared this big devil, flames and everything. And John said, what do you want? And he said, you're coming with me. We sent my little brother and my other brother, and you wouldn't come. Well, you're coming with me. And he grabbed a hold of John, and he picked him up, and he said, and I'm going to give you a whooping like you never had. And he looked over and he saw that old thorny rose bush. He went to grab a limb off that thorn bush to beat him, and the bush grabbed him and pulled him in. Started sticking him with those thorns, and he was howling and howling. He couldn't get out of that rose bush. And of course, John, he was so old now. He said, please, make it stop. He said, no. And he really enjoyed seeing that devil get stuck with those thorns. And finally, he was begging so much, John said, okay, stop. Let him go. And so the bush let him go, and down he went back down to hell. And the devil said, this guy really is bad. I don't know what we're going to do. Let's just leave him alone. Well, John, finally, he did die. And when he died, he went up to heaven. And when he got up there, St. Peter was there, and he says, what do you want? And John said, well, I'm dead. Well, I'm supposed to come to heaven, right? He said, not you. He says, we're not letting you in here. He says, well, where do I go? He says, well, you got to go down to hell because you've done a lot of bad things. So John said, all right. So he was taking the road down to hell, and as he was going, he walked past that first little devil who was sitting out there on some rocks. He said, oh my gosh. And he started running. And then he passed up the second devil, his brother. And he said, oh my gosh, it's him. And he began running. And then he got past the third son. He said, oh, it's him. And they ran, and they went into the gates of hell, and they locked him up. And when John got there, he knocked on the gates, and the devil came out. He said, what do you want? He says, well, I went up to heaven. They said I couldn't come in there. And he told me to come down here. And the devil said, well, you ain't coming in here. And he said, why not? You's too mean. We don't need anybody like you. And he says, well, it's so dark out here. What am I supposed to do? And he said, here. And he gave him a lantern. He said, well, where do I go? He says, I don't care. Go to Texas. So John said, all right, I'll go to Texas. So he went to Texas, and he was wandering around. He finally went up into the Chisholm's Mountains, and they say if you go out near Marfa and you look up into the mountains, you can see old Wicked John walking across the mountains carrying his lantern. And some say that's what the Martha Lights really are. So that's the story of Wicked John. I guess we've run out of time. But if you want to hear some more good ghost stories, I think Noe's out of his books, though. But he has a couple of his new books about ghosts. One's in the mines, right? Ghosts in the mines, and the other's on the railroad. So those stories can be found in Noe's latest book. And I'm not giving them mine.
Thank you, Steve. We appreciate it very much.